It occurred to me, after I finished the last talk regarding the gay issue, that I had not done a very good job of following through with what I promised at the beginning, identifying the common myths, the myths common to the misunderstandings of the Church's teaching, common, that is, both to the activists, if you like, the gay activists, and to many Christians, especially fundamentalist Protestants and evangelicals, but not just them. All right, so let me sort that out now, do it properly. 4 myths common to both sides. First, that natural, the word natural in the moral sense, natural in biblical and church teaching, is the same as biologically caused. That's what it means. Biologically caused means natural. Natural means biologically caused, in the context of looking at what is morally appropriate to humans. And in activists, you see this in the argument that, clearly there is a biological predisposition involved in same-sex attraction, SSA, and so therefore it is natural. And then you've got the opposite view, which is that SSA is not natural, and therefore it can't be biologically caused or be largely due to genetics. Okay, so that's the myth that, that's the first myth. Natural and biological are virtually synonymous when we're looking at church teaching and scriptural teaching on natural versus unnatural sexual acts. And it's wrong, because, as I did explain, natural in this anthropological, theological sense to do with morality means relating to the healthy functioning. So it has a biological aspect, but it's relating to the healthy functioning, the intended functioning, and according to purpose of that biology. All right, so what's the second myth? And this is where I obviously didn't make myself very clear in the previous video. The second of the 4 myths I'm going to look at, common to both sides, is that such biological predispositions, natural in that sense, biological predispositions, cannot be morally negative. Some people add, because God doesn't make mistakes. Okay, so if it's a biological predisposition, if it's biologically caused, it can't be morally negative. And so from this falsehood, really, the activists say, therefore, since same-sex attraction is biologically predisposed, largely, then it must be morally neutral. It cannot be wrong in any way or bad, because it's biologically caused, then it's morally neutral at worst. And on the other side, you have the evangelicals and certain Protestant fundamentalists who would say, no. Look, clearly this behaviour is not morally neutral, it's morally bad. The scriptures tell us that, the church has always taught that, and therefore, since we know it's immoral, it cannot be biologically caused. Alright, and the church's answer to that is, well, if you understood the fall properly in what we call concupiscence, the tendency in humans to desire that which they ought not to desire, and the fact that that is inbuilt since the fall, if you understood that properly, you'd realise that in fact it's quite possible for there to be biological components of that concupiscence, that the fall may have had as one of its effects certain biological deficiencies that would vary from person to person, but that would have moral effects as well, that would predispose us towards certain weaknesses. So the idea that if it's biologically natural and biologically caused, it can't be immoral is false, but is held often by both Christians trying to defend the traditional teaching and people to oppose that traditional teaching. All right, what's the third myth? Well, the third myth is to completely misrepresent the traditional teaching. And again, I really only hinted at this in the previous video. The traditional teaching is not that having same-sex attraction, having these desires, is a sin. Okay? That's not the church's teaching. The traditional teaching is not that same-sex attraction is in itself a sin, but that it is a sin is the misunderstanding or the myth that is held in common by many Christians who don't understand the Catholic teaching, Catholic tradition, and by the activists. So the belief that the traditional teaching does accuse all people with SSA of being therefore in sin, just by that very fact, that position is held by the activists, and therefore they say, look, this is a perfect example where the traditional teaching is blaming us for what we can't help. The church is actually saying we're sinners, we're in sin by existing in the way as what we are. I mean, how completely unfair is that? And, they'd be right. It would be unfair if that was in fact the church's teaching. So they reject the church's teaching partly because they believe that we're saying, and the problem is many Christians do say this, not the church, but many Christians do, that SSA is a sin. Simple as that. But that's not the church's teaching. But many activists think that is the Christian teaching, and that therefore that's manifestly unjust to blame people for just being what they are, apart from doing anything. And then you've got some of the Christians who say, well, no, that's right, SSA, it's a sin. It's a sin. You can't be gay and be a true, obedient Christian. At least not in the long term. You must seek to lose your SSA, your same-sex attraction, and gain normal desires, as if becoming heterosexual would suddenly make you sinless sexually, which is, nonsense in the sense that although it's not a sin, these disorders are not sins, they're disorders, there are heterosexual and homosexual disordered desires. But if you think the traditional teaching is that just having these desires makes you a sinner, then as a Christian you're going to defend the indefensible, or as an activist you're going to reject the church's teaching based on misunderstanding. So the traditional teaching is not that SSA is a sin, but that it's a disordered desire, and certain acts that it might lead to are sinful, but that requires actual choices. So what you don't choose can't be an actual sin. That's the church's teaching. Always has been. But it's often misunderstood both by those trying to defend it in ignorance and those who are opposing it. Okay, so that's the third myth, that traditional teaching would say that just being gay or having SSA makes you a sinner just by that act, or by that fact, not that act. What's the fourth myth? Well, the fourth myth is that, and unfortunately, even the church itself has, by poor communication, assisted this one. It doesn't actually believe it, but it gives the false impression that it does by inadequate use of terminology. And the fourth myth is that SSA is uniquely the objective moral disorder. And that means for the activists, they react to that and say, well, how unfair is that? It's just picking on this one group and saying they're objectively morally disordered. It makes them feel like they're not even part of the human race. It's just homophobic bigotry, they would claim. It's an injustice. It's singling them out and it's almost excluding them from the rest of humanity. Okay, and on the other side, you would have some Christians who don't understand well enough the church's teaching, make this the big issue. They would single out. They would say, well, there you go. Look, it says, SSA is an objective moral disorder. or they would, if they didn't base it on that particular terminology used by the Roman Catholic Church, they would base it on the Scripture and say, look, sodomy is the sin sexually. It's one of the worst sins, and it's the big issue in our culture. It's one of the biggest reasons why we're going in the wrong direction in terms of sexual ethics. So what's the true Christian and Catholic answer to that? Well, despite the fact that the Roman Catholic Church doesn't use this term as often as it should, their theology backs up the fact, the theology of all Catholic traditions backs up the fact that in fact all human sexuality is disordered to some degree and in various ways. That's the teaching of the ancient church. No aspect of human sexuality is completely innocent and untouched, because no aspect of human nature is completely innocent and untouched by the fall and by concupiscence. Objective moral disorders, as I said in the previous video, there are plenty, but there is this concept common to Christians and to the activists that same-sex attraction is uniquely identified as the sin, as the objective moral disorder, as the great and the sole perversion of sexuality. And that's false. In fact, many Christians who understand the Catholic tradition well have made the point, and it's a point that's almost undeniable, that in fact what's primarily wrong with our culture in terms of sexual ethics is due to things that happened long before the whole gay issue became a big issue. The heterosexuals have been wrecking marriage for a long time, in many different ways, through very high divorce rates, through changes in legislation, just through a whole cultural shift about what marriage is and whether it's important. Quite apart from the gay issue, heterosexuals have been undermining traditional teaching very effectively and undermining marriage and undermining families for decades. So it is wrong to say that SSA is the big issue, or that it's uniquely a moral disorder, an objective moral disorder, that it stands out amongst all others. Well, there are many objective moral disorders, many things we're attracted to we ought not to be, and not just in areas of sex, as I did make clear in the previous video. And so if I was to suggest anything, I would suggest to the teachers in the church, bishops in particular, to actually start using that word, objective moral disorder, a little more frequently, but not just with regards to SSA. People need to get into context. Otherwise, gay people will feel unfairly singled out. And it will also misrepresent the teaching, the traditional teaching of the church. We need to get it right in the way we communicate it. And only then will people see that we're not just picking on gay people. No, it's wonderful, we're picking on everybody. No, but in all seriousness, we're recognising that the problem is much bigger than just the gay issue or same-sex marriage. These are really symptoms rather than causes of an overall divergence from traditional morality. And I've spoken on another video about why the modern sexual morality is deeply flawed and can be easily shown to be such. But that in itself doesn't prove that traditional morality is correct, but it's a pretty big hint that we've been going in the wrong direction. We may need to relook at what the traditional teaching is. And of course, as a clergyman of the Anglican Catholic Church and as a Catholic Christian, I would recommend to people that they go back to the teaching of the Church based on the Scriptures, also based on the universal witness of human conscience and human understanding of morality throughout history, that we don't jettison things thoughtlessly. So I hope that clarification has at least shown you what those myths held in common are and how we can break them down and help people understand what the real problems are and understand also what the problems are not, so that we don't have people feeling guilty about what they shouldn't feel guilty about or attacking people unfairly and trying to, if you like, square the circle, do the impossible. So that's all I wanted to say about that. I thought it was pretty important to follow through with the promise I made at the beginning of the first video on this topic. There are a number of myths that are common to both sides and that only a better understanding of the Church's traditional teaching and its scriptural basis will help us dispel.